The fluorescent lights flickered faintly above the ward, casting a pale glow over the rows of beds. The hum of ventilators and the steady beep of monitors filled the otherwise silent space. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, a thin layer of fog curling against the glass. The nurse moved between patients with deliberate care. Her steps were quiet, almost unnoticed, yet every motion carried exactness, the way she adjusted an 4-line, checked a drip, or straightened a sheet. A doctor passed by, distracted by a sudden alarm from the monitor, and offered only a cursory nod. She returned it with a soft smile, her attention never leaving the patient in front of her. A young boy lay on a stretcher, his breathing shallow. The nurse leaned over him, noting a slight irregularity in the oxygen readings. She tapped a few keys, adjusted the flow, and repositioned the mask. Minutes later, the child stirred, his small chest rising more evenly. A passing intern barely noticed the correction, assuming the nurse had simply followed routine. Across the ward, a patient called out weakly. The nurse paused, her eyes flicking briefly to a cluster of busy staff clustered near the nurse's station. They were caught in conversation, charts scattered in their hands, unaware of the subtle warning signs she had observed. She stepped toward the bed, her movements calm and efficient, and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried a firmness that drew attention without demanding it. A faint alarm sounded from the far end of the ward. Staff glanced up, momentarily startled. The nurse assessed the source, moving swiftly to the panel and reading the codes. Her hand hovered over the intercom, pausing to evaluate which instructions were truly necessary. She relayed a single, precise instruction to the technician nearby, who nodded and complied. No chaos erupted. Everything remained under control, but the efficiency of her intervention drew eyes, if only fleetingly, from those who had thought her invisible. A gurney rattled down the corridor. 2 orderlies struggled to stabilize a patient whose condition was deteriorating faster than expected. The nurse reached the bed, motioned without a word, and adjusted the patient's position. She lifted the monitor slightly, repositioning it to capture accurate readings. The orderlies followed her lead automatically, instinctively respecting the authority in her movements even if they did not consciously acknowledge it. She glanced around the ward, noting the minor oversights of others, a half-empty oxygen tank left unattended, a line kinked beneath a mattress, a monitor's alarm silenced too long. Each was corrected with minimal disturbance, each a silent act of competence. The staff continued in their routines, unaware that every small adjustment she made was quietly stabilizing the ward. In the corner, a security guard leaned against the wall, scrolling through his phone. The nurse caught his glance and nodded toward the nearest exit, her eyes sharp. He straightened and moved without question. No words were exchanged. Yet the authority in that single gesture commanded compliance. Minutes passed. The ward settled into a rhythm, the background hum of machines and quiet footsteps creating an almost meditative cadence. No one noticed when she paused beside a patient, checking a line and adjusting a drip with the same exactitude as before. No one noticed when she scanned the hallway, eyes sweeping for irregularities, calculating distances, evaluating potential hazards. No one but her knew how tightly the ward was held together in that fragile balance. And yet, the silence that blanketed the ward was fragile. A distant hum, almost imperceptible, began to grow, a faint vibration through the floor that the nurse noted immediately. Her hand hovered near the intercom, not in panic, but in measured preparation. Staff continued their routines, oblivious, unaware that the night was about to shift, and that everything they thought they understood about authority, control, and competence was about to be challenged. Her eyes lingered on the window for a moment, dark shapes moving beyond the glass. She returned to her patient, calm, precise, unshaken. The ward remained unaware, she was present, steady, watching, and they had misjudged her completely. The night deepened, and the ward settled into an uneasy rhythm. Patients moaned softly, monitors blinked, and the faint smell of antiseptic lingered in the air. To the casual observer, the night seemed ordinary, yet the nurse sensed the subtle disturbances that others overlooked. A new patient arrived, an older man, pale and clammy, escorted by paramedics. His vitals were erratic, and he muttered fragmented words about a fall, but his chart didn't add up. The nurse crouched beside him, running a hand over his arm to check for hidden injuries. She noted the subtle bruising along his ribs, the uneven pulse, and the shallow but rapid breathing. While the doctors exchanged hurried, distracted diagnoses, she silently prioritized the interventions. Nearby, a monitor beeped erratically. An intern approached, hesitant, fumbling with the settings. The nurse moved beside him, her presence commanding without words. With a few precise adjustments, the alarm stabilized. The intern looked at her, eyes wide, but she only nodded once, turning her attention back to the patient. No recognition. No spotlight. Just results. In the hallway, the hum of fluorescent lights masked the faint, irregular vibrations from outside. The nurse paused mid-step, her gaze flicking toward the entrance. Nothing yet. But the tension in the air was unmistakable. She noted the unusual pattern of incoming patients, the repeated mentions of trauma that didn't match the explanations on their charts, and the subtle fear in the paramedic's eyes. She catalogued everything mentally, preparing silently for what might come. Two nurses argued over supplies near the storage room. One raised her voice, frustrated that an emergency kit was incomplete. The quiet nurse intervened, not with criticism, but with measured action. She removed a tray from the cart, checked the contents, and handed exactly what was needed without a word. The disagreement dissolved as the nurses complied, almost instinctively respecting her efficiency. Elsewhere, a patient in a side room began to deteriorate rapidly, heart rate spiking, oxygen dropping. Staff scrambled, voices raised. The nurse approached calmly, assessing the scene. She repositioned the patient, adjusted the ventilator, and coordinated a minor procedure with minimal interruption. Within moments, the crisis stabilized. A few staff members glanced at her, sensing her composure, but no one fully understood its source. She moved between beds, always observing, always calculating. Each flicker of doubt in staff behavior, each overlooked detail, she catalogued. There were too many small missteps, too many gaps, and she noted them without hesitation. Her mind worked methodically, anticipating complications that others had yet to imagine. The hum outside grew slightly louder, almost imperceptible, and she paused again, listening. Her fingers brushed a clipboard, adjusting it so that it would be ready in seconds for any emergency. Every motion was calm, precise, restrained, a subtle assertion of authority invisible to most. By the end of her rounds, the ward appeared orderly, yet the nurse knew it had only been kept safe through quiet, calculated interventions. No one had noticed her silent vigilance, yet the early warning signs were clear to her alone. Something was coming. And when it arrived, they would finally see that the quiet nurse they ignored was not only capable, but indispensable. The low rumble grew steadily, vibrating through the concrete floor. At first, it was barely noticeable, a distant drone almost swallowed by the hum of ventilators. But the nurse felt it instantly, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that set her senses on alert. She paused beside a patient, checking the monitor, but her attention was on the faint tremor in the building, the irregular shadows moving across the blinds. Something was coming. Suddenly, the sliding doors at the ward's entrance shook as a burst of rotor wash from a Black Hawk hit the parking lot outside. Papers flew from counters, curtains fluttered, and the alarms that had remained silent moments ago finally blared. Staff froze, startled, voices rising in tension. A doctor barked orders, but the nurse's eyes scanned, calm, taking in every angle, every possible exit, every potential hazard. From the roof, uniformed operators descended onto the ward balcony, moving with precision, weapons ready. The hum of their presence was controlled but insistent. Staff recoiled, stepping back, instinctively shrinking into corners. Panic rippled across the room like a current, but the nurse remained at the center of it, silent, calculating. A critical patient lay on a gurney, hooked to multiple monitors. The nurse assessed him first, noting the positioning of tubing, the angle of the spacing of monitors. She adjusted one line with exactitude, keeping the patient stable amid the sudden chaos. Her presence was subtle, but the operators noticed. One of them glanced toward her, eyes sharp, and for a brief moment, acknowledged the unspoken command in her posture. Staff scrambled. Some pulled back, uncertain, while others whispered urgently about the helicopters and armed men outside. The nurse moved between them, a silent current of order in the storm. She gestured to an orderly to secure a curtain, then subtly shifted a gurney to create a clear path. No one questioned her, they simply followed, drawn by her confidence, though they could not name it. An operator spoke into his radio, and another checked the perimeter. The nurse positioned herself near the patient, kneeling slightly, one hand on the other on the monitor. Her movements were deliberate, silent commands flowing through gestures alone. The staff began to notice, glances exchanged as the realization crept in, she had anticipated this, had prepared, had already created a path for action before anyone else could react. The Black Hawk's rotors kicked up more debris outside. A nurse screamed as a piece of equipment fell, but the quiet nurse simply signaled for calm, moving the frightened staff back toward a safe corner. Her hands never trembled. Her voice was soft, almost too quiet to hear over the chaos, but it carried the weight of authority. One of the operators approached, assessing the room, then paused. Their eyes met hers, and a brief nod passed between them, an acknowledgement of competence, unspoken but undeniable. The staff watching from nearby walls could not understand the depth of the exchange, only that she held command without a title, without introduction. The patient's monitor beeped rapidly, a minor complication. The nurse adjusted the lines, checked the vitals, and stabilized the readings with calm efficiency. Staff glanced again, this time with subtle awe, but still no one spoke her name. She remained quiet, unassuming, yet entirely in control. The operators moved through the ward, weapons trained outward, scanning for potential threats. The nurse directed subtly, indicating areas to secure, guiding staff to reinforce positions near critical patients. Each movement was precise, minimal, and efficient, a map of action laid silently in her gestures. Outside, the rotor noise intensified, and the presence of the Black Hawk pressed the ward into a tense stasis. The nurse's eyes scanned once more, noting small vulnerabilities, minor gaps in staff readiness, the shifting positions of equipment and patients. She adjusted each detail quietly, without fanfare. The room had shifted from ordinary night to a stage of imminent danger, yet within it, the nurse was the only steady presence. Staff began to follow her lead instinctively. She did not ask. She did not demand. She simply moved, and they responded. And in that instant, amid the chaos of whirling rotors, shouting staff, and armed operators, the quiet truth settled in, the nurse they had ignored was the single point of order. They did not yet understand the full scope of her authority, but it was visible in every calm decision, every subtle gesture, every precise correction. The ward was ready, even as the threat pressed closer. And the nurse remained the quiet center of it all, unseen yet entirely present, waiting for the moment when her foresight would be tested beyond anything they had imagined. The intruders moved with controlled precision, but their presence alone sent waves of tension through the ward. Staff backed away instinctively, some cowering behind counters, others gripping clipboard edges as if they could anchor themselves to sanity. The hum of the ventilators, the beeping monitors, and the distant rotor blades created a chaotic symphony. Yet in the center of it all, the nurse remained a calm island, her movements deliberate and measured. A critical patient on a gurney required immediate attention. Lines tangled beneath him, monitors blaring alarms that the frazzled staff could not quickly interpret. The nurse stepped forward without hesitation. She knelt beside the gurney, scanning the readings, adjusting the flow of oxygen, and straightening tubing in a single, fluid motion. Staff paused, unsure whether to interfere. They needn't have. Her competence was evident in every motion. One of the special ops operators approached, surveying the ward with a tactical eye. His gaze fell on the nurse. She did not look up immediately. Instead, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod toward a corridor where another patient had started to deteriorate. The operator followed her gesture, moving with quiet trust. Another glance, another silent signal, and the team adjusted their positions, blocking entry points and clearing paths, all guided by her subtle commands. A young intern, overwhelmed by the sudden crisis, froze beside a patient, unsure how to respond. The nurse's voice cut through the noise, calm and precise. Move the line to the left. Check the O2. Keep it stable. The intern obeyed, almost instinctively, noticing that she spoke with certainty that left no room for doubt. Within seconds, the immediate threat to the patient's vitals subsided. No one applauded. No one commented. The act itself was quiet but decisive. Across the ward, a door to a supply room rattled. 2 intruders had entered, scanning for high-value targets. Staff gasped, some attempting to intervene. The nurse's eyes swept the room, calculating angles, distances, and probable paths. She raised a hand subtly, indicating that a gurney should be moved to create a barrier. It slid into place almost effortlessly, separating the intruders from patients. They hesitated, momentarily caught off guard by the ward's improvised layout. Her focus never wavered. One patient's monitor began to spike again, heart rate erratic, oxygen dropping. The nurse moved between the operators and the patient, coordinating care without hesitation. A gentle touch to the ventilator, a flick of a wrist adjusting a sensor, a soft instruction whispered to a nearby staff member, all synchronized, almost imperceptible, yet entirely effective. The operators began to notice patterns in her movements, the way she anticipated the intruder's next step. One approached her cautiously, lowering his weapon slightly. She gestured toward a cluster of equipment in the corner that could be repositioned to maintain safe pathways. He nodded, silently accepting her guidance. The other staff were too distracted to recognize the significance, but the operators had begun to understand. She was directing the ward without overt assertion. An intruder advanced toward a patient, weapon raised. A nurse shouted, panicked, stepping in the path. The quiet nurse intercepted, placing herself between the threat and the patient with measured precision. Her body language conveyed authority, control, and restraint simultaneously. The intruder paused, confused by the unexpected confidence. Moments later, one of the operators moved in, following her subtle cue, redirecting the threat without aggression. A series of minor alarms erupted across the ward: monitors, equipment malfunctions, alerts from patient beds. Staff scrambled, some yelling instructions over one another. The nurse moved calmly from station to station, correcting errors, stabilizing patients, and redirecting staff with gestures, one-word commands, and precise adjustments. Every action was deliberate, economical, restrained. The ward remained functional, almost serene amidst the tension, because she had taken command silently. Her eyes caught movement at the entrance again. A team of operators blocked the hall, weapons raised, scanning for threats. She signaled subtly, 2 fingers, then a sweep of her hand, indicating where patients should be moved to minimize risk. Staff complied without hesitation, guided by her authority even as they failed to consciously recognize it. Moments stretched. The ward was a tension-filled crucible. Each second held the potential for catastrophe, yet nothing unraveled. The nurse moved with quiet mastery, stabilizing every patient, guiding every staff member, and coordinating with the special ops team through small gestures and precise instructions. Her competence was no longer a secret to those operators, it was a tangible presence that commanded acknowledgement without a word. By the end of the confrontation, the immediate danger had been contained. No one was injured, no critical care disrupted, and the ward remained orderly. Staff looked on in stunned silence, some beginning to notice that the quiet nurse they had ignored was not only competent, but indispensable. The operators exchanged glances, nods, subtle signs of respect passing between them and her. And still, she said nothing. She straightened the gurney one last time, adjusted a line, and stepped back, observing the ward with the same calm vigilance she had maintained throughout. The threat had been checked, but she had paid the cost silently, minute exhaustion, tightened jaw, tension in her shoulders, but she carried it without dramatics. The ward settled, briefly, into a cautious rhythm. The staff were shaken, aware that something extraordinary had occurred, yet unable to fully articulate it. The nurse moved quietly to her next task, tending to a patient with gentle precision, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The first confrontation had revealed what no one had seen before: authority can be silent, subtle, and yet absolute. The ward had not returned to normal. The rotors of the Black Hawk still hummed faintly in the distance, a constant reminder that the threat outside had not dissipated. Inside, the intruders had pulled back to assess, regroup, and wait for the next move. Panic still lingered in the air, subtle but persistent, and the staff moved in fits and starts, hesitant to take independent action. The nurse stood near the center of the ward, her posture calm, eyes scanning every patient, every corner, every staff member. She had already memorized the room's layout in her mind, the location of every monitor, the trajectory of each corridor, and the placement of every potential hazard. Her hands moved deftly, adjusting IVs, straightening monitors, and quietly stabilizing patients whose vitals were fluctuating under the stress. A special ops operator approached, reporting the intruder's movements outside the ward. He spoke quickly, assuming command. The nurse listened, eyes narrowing subtly, then gestured with a small, precise motion toward a section of the hallway. It was enough. The operator paused, recognized her intent, and repositioned his team accordingly. She did not speak beyond the motion, no explanation was needed. The staff were beginning to realize they were no longer the ones leading the ward. Instructions from doctors were conflicting, some panicked, some hesitant. The nurse stepped between them, her gestures minimal but authoritative. A gentle tilt of the head, a pointing finger, a hand guiding the movement of a gurney, these were all that was required. Patients were moved to safer positions, staff redirected to critical tasks, and pathways cleared for eventual extraction. A patient in the corner suddenly began to deteriorate, a rapid drop in oxygen saturation. The nurse moved instantly, her hands adjusting the ventilator and checking lines while simultaneously signaling a nearby orderly to prepare a backup oxygen tank. She communicated with precision, her commands silent but effective. By the time a doctor rushed to the bedside, the patient was stabilized. No fuss, no dramatics. Outside, the rotor noise grew louder. The operators needed confirmation for the extraction plan, and the nurse provided it without speaking. A subtle tilt of her head indicated a safe path through the corridor. A raised hand paused the team as she repositioned equipment. The operators followed her lead, eyes flicking to one another in quiet acknowledgement. This was her tacit command, her authority enforced by competence rather than title. Meanwhile, the intruders made a tentative move toward the ward's secondary entrance. The nurse observed silently, assessing angles, distances, and potential reactions from her staff. She repositioned 2 gurneys to create a barrier and gestured a technician to secure medical carts in precise alignment. The intruders hesitated, momentarily disrupted by the unanticipated obstacles. A nurse approached, anxious, asking where to place a patient. The quiet nurse raised a single hand, indicating the safest position, then returned to monitoring the entire ward. The staff member followed without question. There were no explanations, no debates, only an implicit trust in the calm authority emanating from the center of the room. The extraction plan required coordination between the ward staff and the operators. The nurse began to relay subtle cues, small gestures, shifts in body position, and brief nods, to indicate who should move where. Each action was calculated to minimize exposure to danger, maximize efficiency, and maintain patient safety. The operators, trained in combat, deferred to her with growing recognition of her foresight and precision. Even as the ward hummed with tension, she maintained an almost meditative focus. Her eyes tracked every movement, her mind calculating potential risks and contingencies. She anticipated where staff might hesitate, preemptively adjusting their positions, ensuring that every patient and every corridor was accounted for. Every small decision rippled through the room, directing the ward's response without the need for overt authority. A sudden alarm from a monitor drew the attention of multiple staff members at once. The nurse moved calmly between them, assessing the problem and resolving it with minimal intervention. Her hands worked silently, her gestures communicated intent, and her eyes met those of the operators, who now watched her like a strategist commanding an unseen battlefield. Time passed in tense minutes. The ward remained intact. Patients were stable. The intruders had been checked temporarily, and the operators now trusted the nurse to coordinate the extraction. No one outside the room could see the quiet chain of command she had established, but inside, it was absolute. As the first signals came for the Black Hawk to descend closer, the nurse stepped to the central corridor, eyes sweeping the room. Staff moved in synchronized rhythm, gurneys rolled in alignment, monitors adjusted, and doors cleared, all under her unspoken command. The ward, once chaotic, was now prepared for the next phase. She allowed herself a small pause, taking in the quiet efficiency she had imposed on the chaos. There was no pride, no claim to recognition. Only the steady acknowledgement that the ward would survive the night because she had seen the dangers before anyone else, calculated the risks, and directed every movement with silent authority. The operators nodded once more, a subtle gesture that carried more weight than any word. They were following her orders now, not by demand, but by necessity. The nurse's authority had become tangible, yet still invisible to most. And the danger outside the ward was only growing. The tension in the ward thickened like a storm cloud ready to break. The distant roar of the Black Hawk continued, punctuated by faint, irregular knocks against the roof and walls. The intruders had shifted their positions outside, probing, testing, waiting for mistakes. Inside, the staff were on edge, their panic simmering beneath forced composure. Even routine tasks felt urgent, amplified by the threat pressing from outside. The nurse moved deliberately along the corridor, assessing patient vitals and staff behavior. She noticed subtle cracks in the chain of command, and in turn hesitated while moving a patient, another nurse's hands trembled while adjusting a monitor, a technician questioned a minor instruction. Each lapse, though small, could cascade into disaster. She intercepted them quietly, correcting positions and reinforcing procedures without raising her voice. Her authority was felt through precision and decisiveness, not words. A new complication arose. One of the critically injured patients began to spike dangerously in heart rate, the monitor screaming alarms. The nurse moved instantly, kneeling at the bedside. She scanned lines, checked the ventilator, and stabilized the patient with swift adjustments. Yet even as she worked, she noticed the operators outside signaling tension. They were aware of the risk but deferred to her judgment. Staff watched in muted astonishment, slowly realizing that her calm actions had prevented chaos from turning lethal. One of the intruders pressed toward the side corridor, aiming to create a distraction. A nurse panicked, stepping forward to intervene, but the quiet nurse intercepted with a single hand motion, directing staff to reinforce barriers near the vulnerable patient. The intruder hesitated, thrown off by the organized yet understated defense of the ward. She did not confront him directly, her authority reshaped the environment itself, leaving him uncertain how to act. The operators communicated via hand signals, looking to her for confirmation. She adjusted positions of gurneys and equipment, creating controlled lines of movement for both staff and patients. Every gesture accounted for patient safety, staff limitations, and potential intruder paths. The ward moved like a single organism under her unseen command. Staff anxiety began to rise, subtle complaints and questioning her decisions. "Should we really be moving them here?" a nurse whispered. "Is this safe?" another asked. The quiet nurse paused, assessing the risk. She weighed the immediate threat against patient safety, then gestured a precise, minimal adjustment. The staff followed, seeing the calm certainty in her movements. The moral tension was heavy, each decision involved calculated risk, but she carried it without hesitation, without dramatics. Meanwhile, the critical patient stabilized, but another emergency developed. A monitor in the far corner began to beep erratically, signaling low oxygen. Staff moved toward it, indecisive and hesitant. The nurse intercepted again, signaling which lines to adjust, which equipment to prioritize, which staff member should act. She did not rush, she did not panic. Her movements were restrained, deliberate, and perfectly timed. Each patient was accounted for, each staff member guided, each potential hazard minimized. Her body carried the tension of constant vigilance. Shoulders tight, jaw firm, eyes sharp, yet she maintained a calm exterior. The operators outside noted it, a quiet assurance in her posture, in the way she anticipated every movement. Even as the intruders tested their limits, her presence contained the chaos. A younger staff member fumbled with a monitor, alarm rising. The nurse moved beside him, adjusting the settings with one hand while signaling another staff member to prepare backup oxygen. The room remained tense, but controlled. The moral weight of every decision pressed on her. One misstep could cost lives, but she bore it silently, without complaint or recognition. The Black Hawk outside grew louder, its shadow sweeping across the ward floor as if impatient to descend. The intruders outside had begun to coordinate more aggressively, sensing hesitation among the staff. The nurse anticipated this, positioning gurneys and equipment strategically to block potential intrusion points. She guided operators with subtle hand signals, confirming extraction routes and patient safety measures, her authority now fully visible to those trained to recognize it. By the end of the hour, the ward had survived the mounting pressure. Patients were stable, staff were aligned with her instructions, and the intruders had been temporarily checked. But the danger was far from over. The nurse exhaled slowly, moving to her next task. Her body bore the fatigue of sustained vigilance, her mind already calculating the next potential threats. The staff, now fully aware that their quiet colleague had prevented disaster more than once, exchanged wary, respectful glances, but no words of praise were offered. The ward remained alive, but the pressure had risen to its peak. And in the center of it, the nurse remained, calm and restrained, silently commanding both staff and operators. The night was far from over, and the cost of authority, though unseen, was already being paid. The ward had reached a fragile equilibrium, but it was a tense calm, a thin line between control and chaos. Every sound, the steady beep of monitors, the shuffle of exhausted staff, the distant hum of the Black Hawk, felt amplified. Outside, the intruders tested the perimeter again, their movements deliberate and probing. Inside, the nurse knew that the smallest lapse could turn this calculated order into catastrophe. A patient in critical condition required repositioning. The four lines were tangled, the oxygen masks slightly misaligned, and the ventilator's readings fluctuated unpredictably. Staff hesitated, unsure how to proceed under pressure. The nurse moved immediately, kneeling beside the patient. She adjusted tubing, recalibrated the ventilator, and stabilized vitals with hands that were steady, precise, and deliberate. A monitor blared briefly, drawing attention, but she silenced it with a flick of her wrist. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the ward. One of the intruders had advanced toward the side corridor, looking for access points the staff had overlooked. A nurse screamed, stepping forward instinctively. Without a word, the quiet nurse intercepted, positioning herself between the threat and the patient. Her body was taut but controlled, her presence a barrier of authority. The intruder paused, uncertain, then withdrew slightly, forced to reconsider. The operators, stationed near the entrance, noticed the maneuver. One stepped forward, but she subtly signaled that the risk was contained. He halted, acknowledging her judgment without words. Staff, witnessing the calm and precise handling of danger, began to trust her implicitly, even though they did not yet understand why. Another complication arose, a ventilator alarm from the far corner of the ward, near a patient whose condition had been stable. A sudden drop in oxygen saturation demanded immediate attention. The nurse moved, her path intersecting with the intruder's tentative advance. She assessed the situation in a heartbeat, deciding that stabilizing the patient took precedence over personal safety. She adjusted the ventilator, readjusted tubing, and calmed the patient with minimal movement, all while maintaining a watchful eye on the intruder. The intruder shifted, testing the perimeter, but her posture, calm and controlled, dissuaded further action. She had assumed risk deliberately, balancing patient safety with her own exposure. The operators outside noted this, recognition flickering in their eyes. She did not shout, she did not command, they followed because they understood, in that instant, her authority and judgment. Meanwhile, staff struggled with minor errors, uncertainty creeping in. The nurse guided them subtly, gestures, small motions, precise positioning, without verbal correction. Every instruction was economy itself, every action reinforced control and minimized danger. Her focus was absolute, yet the human cost was visible in the tension she bore alone. Her jaw tightened as fatigue set in, yet she made no outward sign of strain. A sudden jolt from the Black Hawk above shook the ward momentarily. Equipment rattled, a monitor beeped erratically, and a nurse froze in the hallway. The quiet nurse immediately intervened, stabilizing the equipment, redirecting the staff, and ensuring the patient nearest to the disturbance was unharmed. She had absorbed the potential chaos personally, paying a silent cost for her authority. The operators signaled that extraction would proceed soon, but timing was critical. One misstep could endanger the patient still tethered to multiple lines. The nurse calculated every second, coordinating the staff and operators in a subtle choreography that minimized exposure to risk while maximizing readiness for extraction. She knelt briefly, checking the patient's vitals again. Sweat dampened her brow, her hands moved with precision, and her breathing remained even. No one noticed the strain she carried, the quiet fatigue accumulating in her shoulders and spine. Her authority required not only foresight but also personal endurance, she bore both silently. Minutes stretched. The extraction route was finalized, the Black Hawk in position, the operators ready, the staff aligned. But the nurse's vigilance remained absolute, as if the ward could not survive without her constant attention. Her calculated risks had kept patients alive, minimized staff error, and constrained the intruder's movements. She had intervened directly, personally, and deliberately to prevent catastrophe. By the end of the sequence, the immediate danger to patients was contained. Staff had followed her without question. Operators now deferred to her guidance as a matter of necessity, acknowledging, without words, the authority she wielded through calm competence alone. Yet she did not seek recognition, did not pause to note her own endurance. The cost was paid silently, tension etched into her posture, fatigue in her movements, moral weight pressing unrelentingly on her decisions. As she rose to her feet, straightening a gurney and adjusting a monitor one last time before the extraction, the ward remained tense but intact. The intruders were temporarily checked, patients were stable, and staff now moved with coordinated precision under her unseen command. She exhaled quietly, letting her eyes sweep the room one final time before turning toward the corridor where the Black Hawk would descend. Her work had been dangerous, personal, and decisive, and entirely without recognition. The Black Hawk hovered above the hospital, rotor wash rippling across the parking lot and sending loose debris scattering into the night. Inside the ward, tension was almost palpable. Every staff member, patient, and operator was poised on the knife edge of precision, waiting for the exact moment when extraction would begin. The nurse moved through the ward with quiet authority. Her eyes swept every corner, taking in each patient's position, the placement of monitors, and the orientation of 4 lines. Even small details, the angle of a gurney, the slack in a tubing line, the path through which operators would navigate, were noted and adjusted with methodical care. Her movements were calm, measured, deliberate, and yet carried the full weight of command. A special ops operator signaled her silently, indicating the approach of extraction personnel to the emergency stairwell. She nodded subtly, repositioning a gurney and directing staff to secure the immediate area. One nurse hesitated, uncertain whether to move a monitor, and the quiet nurse gestured with a single finger, motioning it to safety. The staff obeyed instantly, following her lead without question, though they did not fully comprehend why she was trusted implicitly. The patient designated for extraction lay stable but vulnerable, hooked to multiple monitors and life support systems. The nurse knelt beside them, checking lines, adjusting oxygen flow, and securing the patient to the gurney. Her hands moved efficiently, every motion precise, yet each adjustment carried a weight of responsibility. The operators observed closely, recognizing the competence and restraint behind her every move. Outside, the rotor noise intensified, shadows flickering across the ceiling. The intruders had not completely withdrawn, but the nurse anticipated their movements, repositioning staff and equipment to minimize exposure. The corridor was clear, the route to the extraction point calculated to reduce risk while maximizing speed. Her tactical awareness was evident in every gesture, though no one spoke it aloud. A junior nurse faltered, unsure whether to carry a bag of essential equipment alongside the patient. The quiet nurse guided her with a simple hand movement, indicating the safest and most efficient path. The nurse obeyed, her anxiety tempered by the understated confidence emanating from the center of the room. The operators moved forward, stepping through the ward with practiced precision. Yet even they deferred to the nurse's judgment. She signaled subtly, a tilt of her head, a brief hand motion, and they adjusted positions accordingly. Every action she took ensured that both the patient and the staff remained protected while maintaining the flow of the extraction. One of the intruders attempted to re-enter the ward from a side corridor. The nurse intercepted without confrontation, guiding staff to reposition themselves as a barrier. Her posture conveyed quiet authority, a warning that did not require speech. The intruder paused, uncertain, and ultimately withdrew. No one spoke her name, but her control over the space was absolute. With all patients secured, the gurney wheeled smoothly through the corridor, guided by staff under her direction. The operators cleared the stairwell and prepared the passage for the final transfer. The nurse stayed at the patient's side, adjusting lines, checking monitors, and confirming vitals remained stable. Every second mattered, and every small adjustment carried the potential to save or risk a life. The Black Hawk descended onto the landing pad outside, rotors whipping the night air into a chaotic torrent. The extraction team moved in, operators lifting the patient onto the aircraft while she coordinated from inside. Her gestures indicated the proper spacing, the safest approach, and the correct orientation for the gurney. Staff moved in silent synchrony, trusting her judgment completely. As the patient was secured and lifted onto the aircraft, the nurse remained in the corridor, overseeing every motion. Operators glanced at her briefly, nodding in acknowledgement. There was no applause, no recognition, only the unspoken understanding that without her guidance, the extraction could have faltered. Once the Black Hawk lifted, the rotor wash subsiding, the ward remained tense but intact. Staff exchanged quiet looks, their astonishment mixed with subtle relief. The nurse straightened a line, adjusted a monitor, and checked the vitals of the remaining patients, her work far from complete. Yet she carried no sense of triumph, no desire for acknowledgement. Her authority had been exercised quietly, effectively, and invisibly to most. The operators filed out, leaving the ward under her supervision until normal routines could resume. She observed, recalculated, and subtly guided staff back to standard positions, ensuring that patient care continued without disruption. The extraction had succeeded, and the ward remained stable, all under her silent, restrained command. Finally, she paused, surveying the room. The tension ebbed slightly, the hum of machines now dominating the auditory space. Staff returned to their routines, glances of cautious respect passing between them, though none spoke her name. The nurse's posture remained calm, her focus still steady, eyes scanning for the smallest anomalies. The Black Hawk was gone, the intruders checked, and the patient safe, but the responsibility she bore remained, silent, heavy, and entirely hers. In that quiet aftermath, the ward was restored not by recognition, but by competence. The nurse's authority had been asserted, validated by action and observation, yet she remained unobtrusive. No one would write her name in reports, no one would praise her publicly. The work was done, and she simply returned to the next task, the calm center of a still tense storm. The ward's silence was brittle, stretched taut by the anticipation of what might come next. The night had been tense, the Black Hawk extraction complete, yet a lingering threat remained. The intruders outside, realizing the extraction had succeeded, regrouped, testing the perimeter one last time. Inside, the staff were on edge, aware that danger could return, and that every action carried weight. The nurse moved deliberately between beds, checking vitals, adjusting lines, and scanning the ward. She noted subtle shifts, the slight tremor in a staff member's hands, the change in monitor readings, the faint reflection of movement across the window glass. Her eyes were calm, but they recorded every anomaly, anticipating the next move. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the side corridor. One of the intruders had breached the hospital perimeter, moving quickly but cautiously. Staff froze, unsure how to respond. The nurse reacted instantly. Her body positioned between the intruder and the nearest patient, gestures precise, commanding without words. The intruder paused, unnerved by her quiet authority, momentarily unsure whether to advance. A special ops operator, stationed near the entrance, moved forward, weapon raised. The nurse subtly tilted her head, directing him to maintain distance and observe, allowing her to manage the immediate threat. The operator hesitated, recognizing her command. He obeyed, a silent acknowledgement that her authority in the ward was absolute. The intruder advanced, testing the ward's defenses. The nurse assessed distances, potential paths, and patient vulnerabilities. With a single, deliberate motion, she repositioned a gurney, creating a controlled barrier that limited the intruder's movement. Staff moved instinctively, following her silent cues, reinforcing the line of defense. The intruder lunged toward a monitor, attempting to disable it, but the nurse intercepted without force, redirecting him with a subtle yet commanding stance. The operators flanked him, moving only as she indicated. Her authority dictated the response, not through aggression, but through precision, timing, and anticipation. A patient's alarm blared suddenly, a secondary complication, but the nurse addressed it calmly. She adjusted the lines, stabilized vitals, and returned attention to the intruder, maintaining perfect control over both crises simultaneously. Staff watched, awestruck, realizing that her competence had orchestrated the ward's survival. The intruder attempted to retreat, regrouping for another approach. The nurse anticipated the movement, guiding operators with a subtle gesture, signaling where to intercept without exposing staff or patients. The operators followed seamlessly, executing the plan she had silently outlined. The intruder was contained, neutralized without overt violence, and prevented from causing further harm. Throughout the confrontation, the nurse maintained a careful balance. Every decision involved moral and tactical consideration, patient safety versus personal risk, immediate action versus strategic patience, restraint versus authority. Each choice was executed without drama, measured and precise, and each one bore weight only she fully understood. Staff began to notice the pattern. Her calm, controlled interventions had consistently prevented escalation. The operator's deference, once subtle, became evident. She did not raise her voice. She did not issue commands aloud. Yet the ward followed her strategy flawlessly, the intruder's threat neutralized, and patient care uninterrupted. The final seconds were tense. The intruder, recognizing the failure of his attempt, hesitated near the exit, trapped by both the operators and the physical barriers she had orchestrated. The nurse maintained eye contact, her posture steady and unwavering. A single hand motion signaled the operators to step forward, escorting him safely out of the building without incident. With the threat removed, the ward slowly exhaled. Staff checked monitors, adjusted lines, and moved to reassess patients. The nurse walked among them, performing quiet checks, making subtle adjustments, and ensuring no detail had been overlooked. Her presence remained calm, her authority unspoken yet absolute. The operators exchanged brief glances with her, acknowledging competence without words. Staff looked on, realization dawning that the quiet nurse who had been overlooked was, in fact, the anchor that had held the ward through chaos. Recognition was not verbal, applause was absent, yet her command had been validated by outcomes, every patient safe, every staff member aligned, every intruder neutralized. As the night settled, the nurse returned to the central corridor. She adjusted a monitor, straightened an 4-line, and observed the ward in silence. The immediate danger had passed. The Black Hawk had extracted the critical patient. The intruders were gone. Yet the calm, disciplined vigilance that had guided every action remained intact. No one called her name. No one celebrated. There were no accolades, no spotlight. Only the quiet, unassuming presence of a professional whose competence had commanded obedience and preserved life. The authority she exercised was subtle, restrained, and earned entirely through action. In the stillness of the aftermath, the ward seemed almost ordinary, though it had survived extraordinary pressure. Patients rested, staff resumed their duties cautiously, and the nurse moved quietly among them, tending to the smallest needs with precision and care. Her work had been decisive, heavy, and unseen, but its impact was undeniable. Dawn crept slowly through the blinds, casting muted lines across the ward floor. The chaos of the night had dissipated, leaving a fragile calm. Monitors beeped steadily, patients rested, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and quiet tension. The Black Hawk was gone. The intruders had been neutralized. Yet the atmosphere still carried the weight of the night's events. The nurse moved through the ward as she always had, deliberate, measured, precise. She checked 4 lines, adjusted monitors, and ensured every patient was stable. Staff went about their tasks cautiously, glances occasionally flicking toward her. There was a new respect in those looks, subtle but undeniable. They had seen what she could do, even if they could not fully articulate it. A doctor approached, hesitating with a clipboard. He wanted to ask questions, to assess the ward's performance, to commend those responsible. The nurse offered nothing more than a quiet nod and a subtle gesture toward a patient needing attention. He recognized the unspoken authority she carried and moved on, words unnecessary. The operators, still stationed outside for a short perimeter check, cast glances toward the windows. One of them gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The acknowledgement was silent but complete. The nurse's command of the ward, the extraction, and the threat had been flawless. No one outside the operation needed her to speak, her competence had already defined her authority. Staff whispered among themselves, recounting the events, trying to make sense of the quiet nurse they had underestimated. A monitor alarmed briefly, drawing the attention of a young intern. The nurse moved beside him, guiding adjustments with simple gestures. No words. No show. Just precision, effectiveness, and control. She was the quiet center of the ward, yet her presence ensured that every patient remained safe. She paused at the window, looking out at the city slowly waking. The wind from the street below shifted papers and curtains, a reminder of the night's chaos. Her hands were slightly worn, her eyes tired, but her posture remained calm, restrained, and vigilant. The cost had been high, hours of tension, moral weight, personal risk, but she carried it silently, unseen by most, uncelebrated, yet entirely accepted by those who had needed her the most. In the hallways, staff were tidying, rechecking charts, and quietly resuming routines. They moved with a subtle alignment to her instructions, even if unspoken. Every patient was accounted for, every risk minimized. Her authority had been exercised through competence alone, leaving no trace of ego or spectacle, only results. A nurse who had panicked earlier approached cautiously, adjusting a line at a bedside. The quiet nurse placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, guiding the movement without a word. The gesture carried the weight of reassurance, subtle authority, and trust. The staff member nodded, understanding without the need for explanation. No one celebrated her. There were no reports written highlighting her role, no accolades, no public acknowledgement. Yet the ward had survived, patients were stable, and the staff had been guided through an unprecedented night with precision and calm. The cost she bore, the fatigue, the moral decisions, the personal risk, was hers alone. She moved to the central nurses' station, arranging supplies, adjusting charts, and checking monitors one last time. The ward was quiet, functional, and safe. The operators had departed, the threat neutralized, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Her gaze swept across the room, taking in the staff, the patients, and the order she had imposed upon chaos. No one spoke her name. No one sought to understand the full measure of her authority. Yet in the restraint, precision, and silent vigilance of the night, her impact was unmistakable. She took a deep breath, returning to routine duties. The night was over, the ward secured, and the patients safe. The quiet nurse remained just that, quiet, capable, and unrecognized, but her authority had been absolute, earned through action, foresight, and discipline. The ward hummed softly, a steady rhythm of life continuing under her watch. Outside, the city carried on, unaware of the danger that had been averted. Inside, the nurse continued her work, a calm, steady presence in a world that had briefly teetered on chaos. The night was done. The ward endured. And the quiet nurse remained, unseen, uncelebrated, and entirely essential.